Half of history's intellectual legacy was deliberately erased. This is the story of the forgotten women scholars who preserved knowledge throughout the Middle Ages. In an era often called the Dark Ages, these women were quietly safeguarding classical texts, advancing scientific thought, and creating literary works that would otherwise have been lost forever. By the end of this exploration, you will have a completely transformed understanding of medieval history, one that restores these brilliant minds to their rightful place. Why were their names systematically removed from the record, and how did they manage such profound intellectual work against such difficult circumstances? What does it feel like to discover a past more complex and complete than you ever knew? Within the great stone walls of medieval monasteries and cathedral schools, knowledge flowed through exclusively male channels. These institutions stood as the primary centers of learning, where the curriculum was designed by men, for men, creating a formidable barrier for any woman with intellectual aspirations. Religious doctrine and social structures were deeply intertwined, often interpreting female intellectual pursuit as not just unusual, but potentially disruptive. Yet against this backdrop of exclusion, a fascinating paradox emerged. Some remarkable women discovered that the very system designed to limit them also contained hidden pathways to knowledge. For daughters of noble and wealthy families, education often arrived in the form of a private tutor. This was not about preparing for a public career or a university degree, which were unthinkable for women at the time. Instead, it was an education meant to enhance their value in marriage alliances and to manage complex households. They learned to read, often in multiple languages, and were instructed in religious texts, music, and sometimes even basic philosophy or medicine. This private tuition, while limited in its initial purpose, opened a door. It gave them the fundamental tools of literacy and critical thought, tools that a determined few would use to build entirely unexpected intellectual lives. The most significant of these hidden pathways was the convent. Far from being places of simple seclusion, many convents became vibrant, unofficial universities for women. Within their protective walls, women could access extensive libraries of precious manuscripts. They engaged in deep study, theological debate, and the meticulous work of copying texts. A convent provided a socially acceptable space for a woman to dedicate her life to the mind, free from the expectations of marriage and motherhood. Here, the pursuit of knowledge was not a rebellion, but a form of devotion. This complex landscape of obstacles and unexpected opportunities shaped a unique kind of scholar, one whose story was written not in university halls, but in the quiet scriptoria of these female-led communities. Deep within the quiet of her monastery cell, a woman saw the universe not as a static creation, but as a living, breathing entity. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, experienced the world as a symphony of interconnected forces, and she dedicated her life to translating that vision into words, music, and medicine. Her mind was a crucible where science, faith, and art merged, defying the narrow roles available to women of her era. She produced a staggering body of work, from a comprehensive medical text documenting the healing powers of plants and stones to breathtaking musical compositions that soared beyond the rigid structures of Gregorian chant. How did one woman achieve such intellectual prominence in a world that systematically excluded female voices? Her authority stemmed from a source the medieval world could not easily dismiss: her own profound spiritual visions. From a very young age, Hildegard described receiving divine revelations, which she called the shadow of the living light. These were not private meditations, but powerful, sensory experiences that commanded her to record what she saw and heard. In an age where a woman preaching or writing theology was suspect, these visions gave her a unique platform. They provided a sacred justification for her work, allowing her to correspond directly with popes, emperors, and powerful bishops, advising them on matters of faith and state with a boldness that was otherwise unthinkable for someone of her gender. Her scientific curiosity was as boundless as her faith. In her book Physica, she meticulously catalogued the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, animals, and elements, blending classical knowledge with her own direct observations of the natural world. She saw the human body and the earth as mirrors of one another, a holistic approach that feels remarkably modern. This was not abstract scholarship, it was practical wisdom aimed at healing and understanding the intricate balance of life. But Hildegard's genius also found expression in sound. She broke from musical tradition by composing soaring, intricate melodies for her sisters to sing. Her Ordo Virtutum, or the Play of the Virtues, stands as the oldest surviving morality play, a powerful drama set to music where the human soul battles for redemption. In her hands, the convent became a stage for theological exploration and artistic innovation. Hildegard's story reveals a brilliant strategy for intellectual survival. By positioning her work within the framework of divine inspiration, she navigated the strictures of her time, transforming a perceived limitation into her greatest strength. She did not smash the system, she illuminated a path through it, proving that profound scholarship could flourish even in the most confined spaces, and in doing so, she lit a torch for the women who would follow. While Hildegard channeled divine visions, another woman was building a garden of knowledge, brick by scholarly brick. In the Alsace region, Herrad of Landsberg, the abbess of Hohenberg Abbey, undertook a project of staggering ambition. She sought to gather the whole of human and divine understanding into a single, magnificent volume for the women in her care. The result was the Hortus Deliciarum, the Garden of Delights, an illuminated encyclopedia designed as a complete educational curriculum for her nuns. Imagine a book that was also a university, its pages containing everything from theology and philosophy to poetry and science, all woven together to nourish the intellect and the spirit. How do you teach complex ideas without a formal classroom? Herrad's answer was revolutionary. She made knowledge visual. The Hortus Deliciarum was filled with breathtaking illustrations that transformed abstract concepts into vivid, memorable scenes. Detailed diagrams mapped entire philosophical systems, while allegorical images gave tangible form to virtues and vices, allowing her students to see the path to wisdom laid out before them. A nun could look upon a painting and understand the delicate balance of the humors in the body or the hierarchy of the celestial spheres, learning through her eyes as much as through her mind. This was not a simple collection of quotes. Herrad was a master synthesizer, strategically gathering knowledge from an astonishing array of sources. She drew from ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, wove in the writings of early church thinkers, and incorporated the ideas of contemporary scholars. She curated this vast intellectual heritage, translating dense texts into a more accessible format and organizing it all into a coherent, flowing narrative. In doing so, she created an alternative to the male-dominated university, a self-contained world of learning where her community of women could achieve a first-rate education within their own home. The Garden of Delights stands as a monumental achievement in medieval pedagogy, a testament to one woman's determination to ensure that knowledge would not be a locked gate, but an open garden for those she was dedicated to teaching. Yet these women were not isolated mystics or solitary geniuses. Their work was made possible by a powerful, Europe-wide network of female intellectual communities. In the quiet hum of the convent scriptorium, a profound intellectual revolution was taking place. Here, behind cloistered walls, women found not just silence for prayer, but the freedom to think. Convents became unexpected universities, offering three essential gifts that were nearly impossible for women to find elsewhere: time, access, and community. The daily rhythm of prayer and work was structured, but the hours in between were vast, providing the uninterrupted time necessary for deep study and the painstaking labor of copying manuscripts. This was a life dedicated to the mind. Imagine a nun, perhaps at Chelles Abbey in France, her hand carefully tracing the curves of each letter on a fresh sheet of vellum. She is not merely copying words, she is preserving a voice from antiquity, ensuring that a philosophical text or a medical treatise survives for future generations. Her work in the scriptorium was a form of scholarship, requiring a deep understanding of Latin grammar, complex subject matter, and the artistic skill of illumination. This was the engine of knowledge preservation, but these women did more than copy, they created. They composed original poetry, chronicled the histories of their own communities, and wrote detailed theological commentaries. At Gandersheim in Germany, the canoness Hertzwither wrote sophisticated plays inspired by the Roman author Terence, but with a radical twist, she recast his often scandalous plots to celebrate the strength and virtue of Christian women. Her work was a bold act of creative reinterpretation, proving that convents were places of vibrant, original thought. These communities also fostered rich intellectual exchange. The nuns of Barking Abbey in England were renowned for their learning, their library a treasure trove of texts that allowed them to engage with the leading ideas of their day. They corresponded with male scholars, debating points of doctrine and sharing their insights, their voices respected within a wider, trans-European conversation. The convent, therefore, was far more than a refuge. It was a sanctuary for the intellect, a carefully constructed environment where women could build a legacy of learning that would quietly shape the course of European thought for centuries. The true power of these intellectual communities was measured not just in ideas, but in ink and vellum. While scholars debated in distant universities, the survival of knowledge itself depended on the quiet, patient hands of women in convent scriptoria. Their primary tool was the pen, and their focus was the page. Each day, a scribe would prepare her materials with ritual care. She would take a freshly prepared sheet of vellum, stretch it taut, and rule it with faint lines to guide her writing. Then, with a quill cut from a goose feather, she would begin the slow, deliberate work of copying. This was an act of immense physical and mental discipline. A single error could compromise an entire sheet, a significant loss of time and precious material, but these women were far more than human printing presses. They were critical editors and engaged scholars. As they copied, they often left traces of their own minds in the margins. These annotations, known as glosses, could be corrections to a faulty translation, a clarifying note on a difficult passage, or even a personal reflection on the text's meaning. In this way, they entered into a silent dialogue with the author, their own intellect shaping the transmission of knowledge for future readers. Sometimes, their corrections were so insightful that they actually improved the original work, creating a more accurate and reliable version for posterity. The artistry they brought to this work was just as vital. At places like the St. Gallen Monastery, women scribes were masters of illumination. After the text was copied, they would transform the page into a vibrant visual world. They mixed pigments from minerals and plants to create brilliant blues, rich reds, and shimmering gold leaf. With brushes as fine as a single hair, they painted intricate initials that curled into fantastical creatures, and detailed scenes that brought complex theological concepts to life. This visual splendor was not mere decoration, it was a form of deep reading. By illustrating a text, they demonstrated their profound understanding of its content, making the abstract tangible and memorable. One beautifully illuminated copy of a classical work by Virgil or Cicero was not just a book, it was a fortress. It safeguarded a fragile thread of thought through centuries of political change, uncertainty, and neglect. The patient, detailed labor of these women scribes built the very foundation upon which later learning would stand. They ensured that the voices of the past would not be forgotten, preserving the light of knowledge so it could one day ignite the fires of the Renaissance. But the preservation of knowledge required more than careful copying. It demanded the bridging of worlds. While some women safeguarded texts within convent walls, others worked at the vibrant crossroads of cultures, mastering the art of translation. This was the second great method of intellectual preservation, a process of linguistic innovation that brought entire libraries of thought from one civilization into the language of another. Women emerged as ideal translators and cultural mediators, often because their informal education gave them unique access to multiple languages. In the bustling courts of Europe, powerful patrons like Elena of Aquitaine and her descendants understood that knowledge was power. They actively sponsored massive translation projects, gathering teams of scholars to render Arabic scientific texts and long-lost Greek classics into Latin and the emerging vernacular languages. This was not a dry academic exercise. It was a strategic effort to import the most advanced learning of the age, from medicine and astronomy to philosophy, directly into the heart of European thought. Without these efforts, the rich intellectual heritage of the Islamic world and ancient Greece might have remained inaccessible to Western scholars. Consider the work of Marie de France, a poet writing in the 12th century Anglo-Norman court. She took familiar stories like the fables of Aesop and the romantic Breton lies and translated them not just word for word, but spirit for spirit. She adapted these tales for her new audience, infusing them with her own literary voice and a keen understanding of human nature. In her hands, a simple fable about a fox and grapes became a nuanced commentary on desire and perception. By choosing to write in the vernacular French spoken by the aristocracy, rather than the scholarly Latin of the universities, she made this wisdom available to a much wider audience, including noblewomen who are often outside formal Latin education. Her work demonstrates how translation is itself a form of creation, a reinterpretation that keeps old stories alive and meaningful for each new generation. The most vital translation work often happened where cultures met and mingled. In the multicultural cities of medieval Spain, where Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin scholars lived in close proximity, women were perfectly positioned to act as cultural conduits. While often unnamed in the official records, their linguistic skills, acquired through family connections and life in diverse communities, were essential. They could move between languages with an ease that many male scholars, trained exclusively in Latin texts, could not. Similarly, in parts of Italy, connections to the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire provided access to a treasure trove of classical Greek manuscripts. Women in these regions, sometimes as patrons and sometimes as scholars themselves, facilitated the flow of this knowledge westward. They helped translate works on medicine, mathematics, and natural philosophy, effectively rebuilding the connection between ancient Greek science and the emerging universities of Western Europe. This linguistic work was a quiet yet profoundly important form of scholarship. It required a deep, intuitive understanding of two different worlds, their concepts, and their vocabularies. A translator had to find a Latin word for an Arabic astronomical instrument or a French phrase for a Greek philosophical idea, effectively creating new pathways for thought itself. By making specialized knowledge accessible, these women ensured that learning was not a still pond, but a flowing river, carrying the insights of past and distant civilizations into the future. Yet the ultimate act of intellectual courage was not just to preserve or translate, but to create something entirely new. Beyond the quiet scriptoria, women began to compose their own original works, leaving a permanent mark on medieval thought. They moved from being the guardians of old knowledge to becoming the architects of new ideas. In the early 15th century, a Venetian woman named Christine de Pizan confronted a literary world that was overwhelmingly hostile to her gender. After the passing of her husband, she turned to writing to support her family, and in the process, she encountered text after text that portrayed women as foolish, weak, or morally flawed. Instead of accepting this, she took up her pen to build a fortress of words in response. Her masterpiece, The Book of the City of Ladies, was a monumental work of intellectual defiance. She imagined constructing a magnificent city, stone by stone, populated entirely by great and virtuous women from history and myth. Here she gathered queens, warriors, inventors, and scholars, creating a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing attitudes of her time. This was not a simple complaint. It was the invention of a new literary genre, one dedicated to defending women's capabilities and celebrating their forgotten achievements. She used reason and historical evidence to dismantle the arguments of male writers, proving that a woman's voice could reshape the entire cultural conversation. In the realm of science, other women were making equally profound contributions through their original observations. In the southern Italian city of Salerno, a center of medical learning, a woman known as Trota compiled a groundbreaking collection of writings on women's health. Her work, which circulated widely under the title The Trotula, offered practical, compassionate advice on topics from childbirth to general wellness. It blended classical medical theory with her own direct experience and the shared knowledge of other women. For centuries, her texts became the standard reference on women's medicine throughout Europe, influencing how generations of healers understood the female body. Her name became so synonymous with expertise that many later works on the subject were attributed to her, a testament to the enduring power of her original scholarship. What made the writing of these women so distinctive was its deep connection to personal experience. Male scholars often wrote from a position of abstract authority, but women authors frequently drew from the well of their own lives, offering perspectives that were otherwise absent from the record. A nun writing a spiritual guide would infuse it with the challenges and triumphs of managing her community. A noblewoman composing a history would include the political intricacies she witnessed from within the court. This grounding in lived reality gave their work a unique authenticity and emotional depth. It allowed them to explore themes of inner life, personal faith, and communal responsibility in ways that their male counterparts often overlooked. These original compositions reveal a fundamental truth. Medieval women scholars were not passive vessels, merely copying the words of others. They were active, brilliant creators who expanded the very boundaries of knowledge. They offered medical insight, defended their gender, and documented the human experience with a clarity that still resonates today. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that intellectual history is not a finished story, but one we are still piecing together, one rediscovered voice at a time. A fourth, and perhaps most enduring, method of preservation was the creation of entire ecosystems of learning. Beyond writing their own books, women scholars became master architects of education, building institutions and mentoring the next generation to ensure knowledge would not be a single flame, but a self-sustaining fire. Their leadership transformed convents into the closest equivalent of universities available to women, centers of intellectual gravity that drew students from across the continent. In 7th century England, Hilda of Whitby established a monastery that became a legendary beacon of learning. Under her guidance, this community became a cradle for scholars, artists, and even future bishops. It was a place where the latest theological debates were held and where sacred music and poetry were composed. Hilda did not just govern, she mentored, cultivating the talents of those in her care with a rare combination of spiritual depth and intellectual rigor. Her legacy was not merely in the works produced during her lifetime, but in the generations of educated men and women who carried the light of that learning out into a wider world, ensuring its continuation long after her time had passed. Across Europe, in the sophisticated court of the Byzantine Empire, a different kind of educational leadership was taking shape. Anna Comnena, a princess of immense learning, turned her personal passion for scholarship into a powerful force for preservation. After a period of political change in her life, she gathered a circle of the empire's finest minds around her, patronizing their work and engaging in deep philosophical debate. Her greatest contribution, the Alexiad, is a masterpiece of historical writing. This detailed account of her father's reign is far more than a chronicle of battles and politics. It is a rich tapestry of cultural, military, and diplomatic history, preserving for posterity the complexities of the Byzantine world at its height. Through her writing and her patronage, Anna ensured that a crucial chapter of history was recorded not by a distant observer, but by a brilliant insider, giving us a perspective we would otherwise have missed entirely. This educational mission also flourished in the most intimate of spaces, the royal nursery. Educated noblewomen were frequently entrusted with the tutelage of princes and princesses, shaping the minds of future rulers. A queen or a duchess, having benefited from her own private education, would oversee the studies of her children and their courtly companions. She ensured they were fluent in multiple languages, well-versed in classical literature, and grounded in ethics and history. This was a profound form of indirect influence. By instilling a love of learning in a future king or a powerful duchess, these women tutors embedded classical knowledge and intellectual curiosity into the very heart of governance. Their mentorship helped create a ruling class that, at its best, valued wisdom and counsel, thereby extending the reach of female scholarship directly into the halls of power for generations to come. This focus on building educational systems was the ultimate act of foresight. It moved beyond individual achievement to create something self-perpetuating. By founding centers of learning, by writing definitive histories, and by mentoring the powerful, these women scholars engineered a sustainable future for knowledge itself. They understood that to truly preserve an idea, you must plant it in the mind of another, creating a living chain of intellectual inheritance that could withstand the uncertainties of time. A fifth method of intellectual preservation unfolded not in libraries, but in gardens, kitchens, and under the open night sky. Women engaged directly with the natural world, contributing to medieval science through meticulous observation and hands-on experimentation. This was empirical research in its most fundamental form, a practice born from necessity and sharpened by profound curiosity. In fields like medicine, women often held a distinct advantage. As the primary caregivers in their communities, they developed a deep, practical understanding of herbal remedies and healing techniques. This knowledge, passed down through generations and refined by direct experience, formed a vast, informal network of medical science. A woman treating a fever or dressing a wound was not merely following a recipe. She was testing hypotheses and recording outcomes, building a body of evidence that would later be codified into formal texts. Hildegard of Bingen's Physica stands as a monumental example of this practice. She did not just copy ancient authorities, she actively investigated the properties of plants, stones, and animals, documenting their effects with the careful eye of a true naturalist. Her work fused classical learning with original insight, creating a comprehensive guide to the healing arts that was grounded in observable reality. This scientific spirit extended beyond the earth and into the heavens. In the quiet of an observatory or a family workshop, women also contributed to the science of astronomy. They often worked alongside fathers, brothers, or husbands, acting as essential collaborators in a field that demanded painstaking calculation and record-keeping. Their role frequently involved maintaining long-term observational logs of planetary movements or the precise timing of celestial events. This data was the raw material of astronomy, the foundation upon which computational tables and cosmological models were built. By tracking the stars night after night, these women provided the consistent, reliable data that allowed for new predictions and a deeper understanding of the cosmos. Their intellectual labor, though often uncredited, was woven directly into the scientific advancements of their time. Even the most ordinary domestic tasks could become laboratories for discovery. A woman responsible for managing a large household's food supplies became an expert in agriculture and animal husbandry, learning through trial and error which crops thrived in certain soils or how to breed animals for specific traits. The kitchen itself was a center of chemical experimentation, where the processes of fermentation, distillation, and preservation were perfected. The preparation of medicinal remedies from garden herbs was a form of practical pharmacology, requiring precise knowledge of dosages and interactions. This daily engagement with the material world generated a wealth of practical knowledge that was later absorbed into the formal scientific traditions we recognize today. These contributions reveal a crucial truth. Medieval women were not passive observers of the natural order, they were active investigators. They employed empirical methods, recorded their findings, and systematically expanded the boundaries of human knowledge from the ground up. Their work challenges the long-held assumption that medieval science was an exclusively male domain, reminding us that the pursuit of understanding has always flourished in many different spaces, including those quietly tended by the hands and minds of women. In the bustling, sun-drenched streets of Cordoba, a different kind of intellectual revolution was unfolding. While convents in the north preserved knowledge, the vibrant society of Al-Andalus or Islamic Spain actively generated it. Here, a remarkable confluence of Arabic, Jewish, and Christian cultures created an atmosphere of intense scholarly exchange, and within this world, women found unprecedented avenues for learning. The relative openness of Andalusian society meant that for daughters of educated and aristocratic families, a comprehensive education was not just a dream, but a tangible possibility. They studied philosophy, composed intricate poetry, mastered mathematics, and delved into the complex science of medicine, often within the privacy of their own homes, which became intimate, unofficial academies. This was a landscape where intellectual pursuit was woven into the very fabric of elite life, and women were active participants in that tapestry. One name that shines brightly from this period is Lubna of Cordoba. She was far more than a scholar. She was a central figure in the administrative and intellectual heart of the caliphate. Appointed as the palace secretary and the librarian of the royal library, she oversaw one of the most significant collections of knowledge in all of Europe, a treasure house containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Her role was monumental. She was responsible for acquiring new texts, organizing the vast collection, and, crucially, participating in the translation of Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, curating the very texts that would fuel the European Renaissance centuries later. Lubna was not a solitary figure. she was part of a dynamic network of copyists and scholars, many of them women, who worked diligently to reproduce and disseminate this knowledge. Her story demonstrates that in the right cultural environment, a woman could ascend to a position of immense intellectual authority, her expertise recognized and valued at the highest levels of power. Beyond the palace walls, the tradition of learning flourished in aristocratic households. Wealthy families invested in the education of their daughters, seeing it as a mark of status and refinement. These women studied the same rigorous curriculum as their male counterparts, engaging with the works of Aristotle and Plato, debating points of law and theology, and mastering the art of calligraphy. Some of these educated women went a step further, becoming patrons of learning themselves. They used their wealth and influence to sponsor translation workshops, support poets and philosophers, and build private libraries, effectively acting as the engines of cultural production. They created the conditions for scholarship to thrive, ensuring that the great conversation of ideas continued uninterrupted. The unique environment of Al-Andalus, where multiple languages and traditions intermingled daily, was key to this flourishing. This multiculturalism did not erase differences, but it created a pragmatic space where talent could sometimes transcend traditional gender roles. The demand for knowledge was so great, and the projects of translation and commentary so vast, that skilled individuals were valued for their minds, creating openings in the barriers that confined women elsewhere. The legacy of these scholars offers a powerful lesson. It shows that when cultures connect rather than clash, when the pursuit of knowledge is prioritized, the intellectual landscape can expand in unexpected and profoundly inclusive ways. The light from Cordoba did not just preserve old texts, it illuminated a path toward a more capacious understanding of who gets to be a scholar. While the West navigated political change, the flame of classical learning burned brightly in the East. Within the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire, a continuous thread connected the ancient Greek world to the future, and women were the skilled weavers ensuring that thread did not break. Princesses and aristocrats in Constantinople enjoyed an educational tradition unbroken for 1,000 years, studying the original Greek texts of Homer, Aristotle, and Plato as a natural part of their upbringing. This was not a radical act, but an expectation of their station, creating a class of women who were formidable scholars in their own right. Their palaces and villas became fortresses of classical thought, safeguarding the very intellectual heritage that was fragmenting elsewhere. How did this access to an unbroken tradition empower them to act? They used their privilege not for personal prestige, but as a tool for preservation on a grand scale. Anna Comnena stands as the most brilliant example. As the imperial princess, she received an education that rivaled any scholar, immersing herself in philosophy, mathematics, and literature. But her greatest contribution came after a shift in her personal circumstances. She turned her formidable intellect to history, producing the Alexiad, a sweeping account of her father's reign. This was far more than a chronicle of battles. It was a sophisticated work of political and military analysis, rich with literary allusion and philosophical insight, written in a self-assured voice that commands respect even today. In its pages, she preserved not only the events of her time but also the complex diplomatic maneuvers, military technologies, and cultural values of the Byzantine court. She ensured that this crucial chapter of history would be told with the nuance and depth it deserved, directly from the center of power. Beyond writing, aristocratic women acted as vital patrons. They funded scriptoria, the workshops where scribes meticulously copied deteriorating papyrus scrolls onto more durable parchment codices. They maintained extensive private libraries, personal collections that housed precious manuscripts of Sophocles, Euclid, and Galen. This patronage was a deliberate act of cultural stewardship. By sponsoring the copying of these texts, they guaranteed that the foundational works of Western thought would survive the slow passage of time, ready to be rediscovered by a Europe that had largely forgotten them. Their homes were not just repositories, they were active centers of intellectual production where scholars gathered for debate and the work of translation and commentary thrived. In the spiritual realm, women like the Abbess Cassia demonstrated another facet of this scholarly tradition. Renowned for her sharp intellect and theological knowledge, Cassia engaged in public debates and composed a vast body of liturgical poetry and music. Her hymns, still sung in Eastern Orthodox services today, are masterpieces of theological depth and poetic beauty. She seamlessly wove classical Greek language and forms with Christian doctrine, proving that the old learning could be fused with new faith to create enduring artistic works. Her life shows that the preservation of knowledge was not confined to the palace. It also flourished within the disciplined, creative environment of the monastery. The legacy of these Byzantine women is profound. They served as a living bridge, a direct link between the intellectual achievements of antiquity and the hungry minds of the Renaissance. While Western Europe was slowly rebuilding its libraries, these women in the East had never stopped reading, writing, and protecting the books that would one day help relight the fires of learning across a continent. Their story reminds us that the preservation of knowledge is not a passive act, but a conscious choice made by those who understand that the future depends on what we save from the past. But what if a woman sought a life of the mind without taking permanent religious vows? Across the urban landscapes of 13th century Northern Europe, a remarkable answer emerged in the form of the Beguines. These were not nuns in a cloistered convent, but lay women who created their own semi-independent religious communities, forging a revolutionary third path between marriage and the monastery. They lived together in small households or larger court-like compounds, often in the heart of bustling cities like Cologne and Paris, supporting themselves through their own labor while dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and service. This movement represented a profound shift, a grassroots model of female community that was both spiritually devout and vibrantly engaged with the world. How did these women sustain their unusual way of life? They became pillars of the urban economy. Many Beguines worked as teachers, instructing the children of wealthy merchants and thereby spreading literacy. Others were skilled copyists, their meticulous hands producing the books and devotional texts that fueled the intellectual and spiritual life of their cities. A significant number turned to healthcare, nursing the sick and creating remedies, their practical medical knowledge making them indispensable figures in their communities. Through this work, they achieved a degree of economic self-sufficiency that was extraordinary for medieval women, funding their own pursuit of a scholarly and spiritual life entirely on their own terms. Within this environment of intellectual freedom, some Beguines produced theological works of stunning originality and daring. The most well-known and poignant example is Marguerite Porete. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, was a sophisticated exploration of mystical theology, written in the vernacular French so that lay people could access its complex ideas. She described a soul's journey toward divine love in terms so radical and uncompromising that they challenged the institutional authority of the Church. Her work was not a simple devotional guide. It was a deep philosophical treatise that engaged with concepts of releasing the self to achieve union with God. For her refusal to recant her ideas, Marguerite faced severe consequences, yet her book continued to be copied and read in quiet circles for centuries, a testament to the power of her thought. Her story reveals the courage these women scholars showed in voicing their spiritual and intellectual insights, often moving beyond the boundaries of accepted discourse. The Beguine communities were uniquely inclusive, offering intellectual opportunity to women from every social stratum. A wealthy merchant's daughter could live and study alongside a woman from a humble craft family, united by their shared commitment to a life of the mind and spirit. Their homes became hubs of intellectual exchange where women could debate theology, read widely, and write their own reflections without a male overseer dictating the curriculum. This was a form of female scholarship liberated from the rigid hierarchies of both the university and the traditional convent. The Beguine movement ultimately created a fleeting but powerful space where medieval women could author their own lives, both spiritually and intellectually, crafting a legacy of independence that continues to inspire centuries later. These intellectual networks stretched even further into the vibrant and often complex world of medieval Jewish communities. Here, women carved out their own distinct paths to knowledge, navigating a rich landscape of tradition and social expectation to become vital preservers of Hebrew and Arabic learning. While formal rabbinical scholarship was a male domain, the home itself became a powerful center of female intellectual life. In educated families, it was not unusual for daughters to receive instruction in Hebrew literacy and religious texts, a privilege that opened the door to a deep world of thought. This education was often deeply practical, aimed at enabling women to manage a Jewish household according to religious law, but its effects reached far beyond the domestic sphere. A woman fluent in Hebrew could read the prayers, engage with the Psalms, and understand the weekly Torah portion, allowing her to participate in the spiritual and intellectual rhythms of her community from a place of genuine understanding. This foundational literacy was her key to a living library of tradition. This intellectual engagement was often intertwined with economic life. Many Jewish women were active in moneylending and trade, roles that fell to them partly because canonical law sometimes restricted such activities for Christians, creating a unique economic niche. This work demanded a high degree of mathematical literacy and meticulous record-keeping. A woman managing a complex web of loans had to calculate interest, track repayment schedules across multiple currencies, and maintain detailed legal contracts. These were not simple tasks. They required a firm grasp of arithmetic and a systematic approach to information that constituted a form of practical, applied knowledge preservation. Her account books were more than ledgers. They were testaments to a sophisticated understanding of commerce and law, skills that kept vital economic knowledge circulating within and beyond her community. We catch a powerful glimpse of this multifaceted life in the story of Dulce of Worms, a 12th century woman whose legacy was preserved by her husband, the renowned Rabbi Eleazar of Worms. He described her not only as a devoted partner but as a formidable scholar and community leader in her own right. Dulce was said to have supported Torah study financially, ensuring that the work of learning could continue. Even more remarkably, she was described as teaching other women, guiding them in their understanding of religious practice and texts. She did not just preserve knowledge passively, she actively transmitted it, creating a ripple effect of learning among the women in her sphere. Her life embodies the threefold role many educated Jewish women played. They were students of their tradition, shrewd participants in the economy, and dedicated teachers to their peers. These contributions, though often unrecorded in official chronicles, were essential. They demonstrate that the pursuit of knowledge in the Middle Ages was not a single story, but a mosaic of diverse experiences. Jewish women, operating within the specific constraints and opportunities of their cultural context, developed their own unique methods of intellectual engagement. They prove that scholarship is not defined solely by the university or the monastery, but by the enduring human drive to learn, to understand, and to ensure that wisdom is passed safely into the hands of the future. Yet the legacy of these brilliant minds often feels like a whisper from the past. For every Hildegard or Herrad whose name we know, countless others remain unseen, their voices quieted not by a lack of talent, but by the slow drift of history. One of the greatest challenges in exploring women's intellectual contributions is the question of authorship. How do you confirm a woman created a book when her identity was carefully separated from its pages? The very nature of collaborative work in medieval communities often makes individual roles difficult to trace. In a convent workshop, a group of women might join together on a single manuscript, with one composing the words, another adding beautiful artwork, and a third reviewing the work. The finished book was a shared accomplishment, and the notion of placing one's personal name upon it could be viewed as contrary to the collective spirit. This makes it deeply challenging, so much later, to recognize the particular person who first shaped a complex idea or crafted a stunning image. Outside religious communities, many women worked closely with a male mentor, perhaps a father, a brother, or an abbot. Their contribution might have been as a research partner, a translator, or a co-creator, but public recognition for the completed project almost always rested with the man in charge. His name would be written on the opening page, while her foundational work remained in the background, vital but unrecorded. This system of mentorship, while offering important education, consistently directed acknowledgement away from female participants and toward the recognized male figures of the time. To find a path through this uneven terrain, some women used thoughtful, creative approaches. A frequent method was to introduce an original composition as simply a translation. By stating she was only bringing an older work into a contemporary language, a female writer could avoid doubts about her ability for independent thought and help her insights find a more welcoming audience. Other women published under male names, crafting a protective identity that let their writing be considered on its own terms, apart from the biases of their era. This was not an act of hiding, but one of perseverance, a needed approach to let their perspectives reach a broader conversation. The last, and maybe most profound, layer of this fading memory was added by those who came later. When scholars in subsequent centuries rediscovered these old texts, they brought their own ingrained perspectives. Faced with an intricate medical study or a thoughtful philosophical work, they nearly always credited it to a male creator. The concept of a woman generating such detailed scholarship seemed to them unlikely, so they made a note in the edge of a page or in a library record, giving the work to an assumed and male historical person. With a simple mark, a woman's dedicated effort was quietly transferred, her presence gently set aside and her part in the story covered by years of mistaken reference. This is why finding these voices now feels like a kind of historical discovery. It asks researchers to look carefully at the context, to study patterns in the language, to examine small annotations, and to reconsider the credits once accepted without question. Every name brought back to light is a meaningful step, a fragment of a grand historical picture finally finding its place, returning a presence to the whisper and a voice to the quiet. Behind every great scholar stood a patron who made the work possible. While some women created knowledge directly, others wielded a different kind of power, one built on wealth and influence, to construct the very foundations upon which intellectual life could flourish. These women of means understood that great ideas needed material support, and they dedicated their vast resources to creating environments where learning could thrive. Their courts became magnetic centers, drawing the finest poets, translators, and philosophers of the age. In the 12th century, Helena of Aquitaine transformed her court into a vibrant hub of literary and cultural exchange. As the queen of both France and later England, she possessed unprecedented resources and used them to sponsor a renaissance of troubadour poetry and chivalric romance. She actively commissioned translations of classical tales, ensuring that stories of antiquity were retold for a new European audience. Her patronage created a space where ideas could cross borders and languages, fueling a cultural conversation that would shape literature for centuries. Her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, continued this legacy as regent of France. She surrounded herself with theologians and intellectuals, seeking their counsel and supporting their work, thereby embedding scholarly rigor at the very heart of political power. Her court was not just a seat of government, it was a salon where the leading minds of the day could debate and create under her protection and funding. This role of patron was not limited to funding art, it was also about preserving the written word itself. Noblewomen across Europe commissioned the production of lavish manuscripts, funding the scribes and illuminators whose meticulous work kept knowledge alive. They established and stocked libraries within their castles and convents, creating accessible repositories of learning. A beautifully illustrated prayer book commissioned by a duchess was more than a personal devotional object. It was a major artistic and scholarly project that employed a team of creators for months or even years. By financing the creation of these books, these women ensured that texts were not only preserved but also disseminated, copied, and shared, creating multiple copies that could survive the uncertainties of time and conflict. One of the most powerful examples of strategic patronage comes from Matilda of Tuscany in the 11th century. A key supporter of Pope Gregory VII in his conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor, Matilda understood that intellectual arguments were as important as military might. She used her immense wealth and lands to patronize scholars who could articulate and defend the papal position. She provided them with safe haven, financial support, and access to documents, enabling them to produce the legal and theological treatises that shaped the course of the investiture controversy. Her patronage was a deliberate political and intellectual strategy, proving that supporting scholars could directly influence the grand ideological battles of the era. These women demonstrate a profound truth about the history of knowledge. Scholarship does not exist in a vacuum. It requires time, materials, security, and a community of support. A philosopher cannot think deeply if he is hungry. A translator cannot work without access to source texts. A scribe cannot copy manuscripts without vellum, ink, and a quiet place to work. By providing these essential resources, female patrons created the material conditions that allowed intellectual work to happen at all. They were the architects of the intellectual ecosystem, building the libraries, funding the translations, and protecting the thinkers. Their legacy is a reminder that the preservation of knowledge is a collaborative endeavor, dependent as much on the quiet benefactor as on the celebrated genius, a partnership that across the centuries quietly built the future. The world of medieval medicine was not a sterile lecture hall, but a living practice rooted in the home and the herb garden. Here, women were not just assistants, they were the primary practitioners, researchers, and authors of vital medical knowledge. Their expertise grew directly from their traditional responsibilities as caregivers, the ones who tended the sick, managed childbirth, and prepared remedies for their families and communities. This daily hands-on work provided a deep, empirical education in the healing arts, an education grounded in observation and results rather than abstract theory. A woman treating a wound with a poultice of honey and yarrow was conducting a clinical trial. A midwife guiding a mother through a difficult labor was applying a sophisticated understanding of the female body, knowledge passed down and refined through generations of shared experience. This was a vast, informal network of medical science, operating in parallel to the formal university texts written by men, and it was often more immediately effective. The most celebrated figure from this tradition is Trota of Salerno, a physician from the renowned medical school in southern Italy. Her work, which circulated widely under the title The Trotula, was a comprehensive guide to women's health. It covered topics from fertility and pregnancy to general wellness, blending classical medical theory with the practical wisdom she and other women had gathered. Her texts were remarkable for their compassionate, practical approach. They offered sensible advice on diet, exercise, and herbal treatments, focusing on the patient's overall well-being. For centuries, the Trotula became the standard reference on women's medicine throughout Europe, its influence so profound that many later works on the subject were simply attributed to her name. This was not the work of someone merely preserving old knowledge. It was the work of an original scholar synthesizing experience into a new, authoritative body of work. Midwives and local healers, often called wise women, were the guardians of knowledge that was frequently overlooked in formal texts. They understood the intricate process of childbirth in a way male physicians, who were often barred from attending deliveries, simply could not. They knew which herbs could ease labor pains, how to handle a breech birth, and how to care for both mother and child in the weeks that followed. This was specialized, life-saving information that existed almost entirely outside the written record, preserved instead through apprenticeship and oral tradition. Their deep familiarity with local plants also made them walking encyclopedias of botany. They knew not only which herb could reduce a fever, but the precise time to harvest it for maximum potency and the correct way to prepare it as a tea, tincture, or salve. This practical pharmacology was a form of science honed through endless experimentation and careful attention to outcomes. This domain of female expertise represents a profound shift in our understanding of medieval scholarship. Women in medicine were not just copying ancient texts, they were actively generating new knowledge based on direct, practical experience. They were the original clinical researchers, their contributions built on a foundation of trial, error, and proven success. Their legacy challenges the very definition of a scholar, reminding us that some of the most valuable intellectual work is done not with a pen in a quiet library, but with hands in a garden, at a bedside, or in the sacred space of a birth chamber, quietly advancing the art of healing for everyone. A different kind of revolution was taking place not in Latin manuscripts, but in the language of the home and the heart. While some women preserved classical texts, others chose to write in the living, breathing vernacular tongues of everyday life like French and German. This was a radical intellectual strategy. By setting aside the formal Latin of the male-dominated university, they were not admitting defeat, they were building a new bridge to knowledge, one that could carry ideas to a much wider audience. Marie de France, writing in the Anglo-Norman French of the 12th century court, took this path. She transformed ancient tales and Breton lies into something fresh and immediate for her listeners. Her stories, filled with chivalry, romance, and moral complexity, were not simple translations. They were sophisticated literary creations that helped establish vernacular French as a legitimate language for serious art and thought. She proved that profound ideas about love, loyalty, and human nature did not need the cloak of Latin to be taken seriously. They could be expressed with equal power in the language people spoke at court and in their homes. This linguistic choice was a deliberate act of inclusion. It opened the world of literature to noblewomen and even some merchant-class women who, while often literate, had not received the rigorous Latin education reserved for men in universities. A woman could now pick up a book written in her own language and encounter complex philosophical themes, historical narratives, and psychological insight without needing a male scholar to translate or interpret it for her. This created a new, independent readership and gave women direct access to a shared cultural conversation. The vernacular also allowed for a new kind of literary voice, one that was more personal and experimental. Christine de Pizan harnessed this power with breathtaking effect. She wrote in French to directly confront the misogynist texts of her time, crafting the Book of the City of Ladies as a fortress built from the stories of historical and mythical women. In choosing the vernacular, she ensured her powerful defense would be heard not just by clerics, but by the very courtiers and nobles who shaped public opinion. Her work pioneered a new genre, the defense literature, and in doing so, she demonstrated how the language of the people could be used to challenge the deepest prejudices of the age. This shift to everyday language also enabled the birth of new literary forms that explored the inner self. Women began to write spiritual autobiographies and mystical texts in their native tongues, documenting their personal journeys of faith with an intimacy and emotional depth that was rarely found in formal Latin theology. These works explored the landscape of the soul in a direct, accessible voice, creating a new space for personal reflection in European literature. By championing the vernacular, these scholars did more than just make knowledge accessible. They actively shaped the development of modern European languages, elevating them into vehicles for the most sophisticated expression. They ensured that the intellectual legacy of the Middle Ages would not be locked away in a dead language, but would flow directly into the living streams of culture, empowering countless future voices to tell their own stories. The most profound barrier women faced was not in medicine or science, but in theology, a field considered the highest form of intellectual pursuit and one rigidly controlled by male institutions. Yet here, in the very heart of this forbidden territory, they crafted some of their most enduring and innovative works. Without access to the formal university training required for a theologian, women like Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena developed a completely different pathway to authority, one rooted in direct personal experience of the sacred. Their writings did not follow the dry, systematic structures of scholastic debate. Instead, they offered something revolutionary, a spiritual understanding written from the inside out, where the soul's journey was mapped with raw emotional honesty and profound metaphorical insight. How could such personal accounts challenge centuries of established doctrine? Their power lay in their undeniable authenticity. Julian of Norwich, an anchoress who lived in a small cell attached to a church, received a series of visions during a serious illness. She spent the next 20 years contemplating their meaning, producing Revelations of Divine Love, the first known book written by a woman in the English language. Her work is a masterpiece of theological exploration, centered on a God of boundless love and compassion. In one of her most striking visions, she describes Christ not as a distant judge, but as a nurturing mother, a metaphor that offered a comforting, intimate understanding of the divine that was entirely absent from the formal theology of her day. Her famous assurance that all shall be well resonates across centuries because it emerged not from abstract logic, but from a deep, lived encounter with mystery. Across Europe, in Italy, Catherine of Siena, an uneducated daughter of a cloth dyer, wielded astonishing influence through her letters and her book, The Dialogue of Divine Providence. She dictated her work while in states of spiritual ecstasy, and her writing pulsates with a passionate, urgent energy. She fearlessly corresponded with popes and princes, advising them on church reform and political matters. Her authority derived entirely from her claimed mystical union with God. Her spiritual outlook was active and practical, emphasizing charity and the sacred value of everyday life. She argued that the path to the divine was found not in withdrawal from the world, but in loving service within it, a concept that empowered ordinary people in their faith. These women mystics had to invent a new language to describe what they experienced. Since existing theological vocabulary was inadequate, they developed rich allegorical landscapes. They wrote of spiritual journeys through castles, of dialogues between the soul and its creator, of courtship and union with the sacred. This metaphorical language allowed them to bypass doctrinal technicalities and communicate the feeling of faith, the texture of a spiritual life. Their focus was on the heart's knowledge, on a God who could be known through love and relationship rather than through intellectual argument alone. This emphasis on personal experience created an alternative theological tradition, one that remains deeply influential precisely because it speaks to the universal human longing for connection. By grounding their work in the reality of their own spiritual lives, these women scholars found a way to participate in the most prestigious intellectual domain of their age, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape religious thought and offer comfort to seekers today. Numbers governed more than just accounts. They mapped the heavens and shaped the fabric of daily life. For medieval women, mathematical thinking was not an abstract exercise, but a vital tool embedded in the world of commerce, craftsmanship, and even cosmic contemplation. Their contributions to mathematics and astronomy are often invisible because they were so deeply woven into practical tasks. A woman running a merchant business or managing a large estate had to be a master of applied mathematics. She calculated complex interest rates on loans, converted between multiple currencies, and maintained detailed ledgers that tracked income and expenses across vast trade networks. This was not simple bookkeeping. It was a sophisticated form of data management that required a fluent understanding of arithmetic and logical systems. In the booming textile industries of cities like Flanders, women weavers and designers employed geometry intuitively. They worked with intricate patterns and precise measurements, calculating thread counts and loom tensions to create complex tapestries and fabrics. Their hands understood the ratios and symmetries that would later be formalized in mathematical texts, turning cloth into a canvas for geometric expression. This practical mathematics was a form of intellectual labor, essential to the economic and artistic vitality of their communities. Even in the realm of theology, numbers held a sacred power. Hildegard of Bingen saw the cosmos as a divine equation. In her visionary works, she described the universe through intricate numerical symbolism, exploring the harmony of the four elements, the four directions, and the four humors of the body. For her, mathematics was a language that could reveal the hidden structure of creation, a bridge between the physical world and spiritual truth. She wove Pythagorean ideas about the music of the spheres into her own cosmology, hearing the planets not as silent objects, but as celestial bodies singing in a mathematical harmony ordained by their creator. Her interdisciplinary approach demonstrates how a brilliant mind could blend numerical reasoning with mystical insight, seeing calculation as a form of prayer. Behind the great astronomical tables and instruments of the age, we often find the quiet, supporting work of women. In family workshops, where the line between home and laboratory was blurred, women frequently assisted fathers, brothers, or husbands with the painstaking labor of astronomy. This involved maintaining long-term observational logs, tracking the slow movement of planets against the fixed stars night after night. More crucially, they performed the tedious but essential computations needed to create planetary tables, the medieval GPS that predicted celestial events. Their meticulous work with numbers helped calibrate astrolabes and other instruments, tools necessary for navigation, timekeeping, and the church's own calendar. While a man's name might be on the finished instrument, its accuracy often depended on the collaborative mathematical effort of the entire household. This landscape reveals a crucial distinction. We find few female equivalents to theoretical mathematicians like Fibonacci, not because women lacked the capacity, but because the doors to the universities where such theory was debated remained firmly closed. Their mathematical genius was expressed not in formal proofs, but in the fluent application of numbers to solve real-world problems. They were the accountants, the engineers, the designers, and the computational assistants whose work made theoretical science possible. Their legacy challenges us to expand our definition of a mathematician, to see the intellectual rigor in a perfectly balanced ledger, a geometrically perfect tapestry, or an accurately predicted eclipse. It reminds us that the history of numbers is not only written in equations, but also in the quiet, competent hands that use them to build, to create, and to understand the world. A great shudder passed through the foundations of medieval society in the mid-14th century, a demographic catastrophe that would paradoxically create cracks of light for women in the world of ideas. The outbreak known as the Black Death swept across Europe, leaving profound change in its wake and reshaping the social landscape in unexpected ways. The sheer scale of this event created a desperate labor shortage that, for the first time, forced a re-evaluation of women's roles in the economy. With fewer men to fill positions as scribes, merchants, and guild members, women were increasingly called upon to step into these roles. This sudden demand for their skills provided a new, practical justification for female literacy and education. A woman who could keep complex accounts for a trading business or read legal documents related to property was no longer just an exception. She was a vital asset to her family and community's recovery. This economic necessity began to loosen, just slightly, the rigid constraints that had long limited women's public and professional lives. In the spiritual realm, the collective experience of the era fostered a deep hunger for new kinds of religious expression. The established church, seen by many as having failed to protect people, faced a crisis of authority. In this vacuum, there was a surge of interest in personal, direct experiences of the divine, the very domain where women mystics had long established their credibility. The visionary writings of women like Julian of Norwich, with their messages of a loving, compassionate God, resonated powerfully with a population yearning for comfort and meaning. Their accounts of spiritual journeys offered a form of solace that felt more immediate and authentic than distant theological debates. This cultural shift created a wider audience and greater legitimacy for women's theological insights, transforming what was once a marginalized path into a central stream of late medieval spirituality. Their voices, once confined to quiet corners, were now sought after as guides through a changing world. Economically, the redistribution of resources following this period also worked to the advantage of some women. With inheritances passing to surviving daughters and widows gaining control over family estates, a number of women found themselves with unprecedented financial independence. This control over property and resources was the single most important factor in enabling intellectual pursuits. A woman with means could now choose to use her funds not merely for survival, but for patronage. She could commission the copying of manuscripts, build a personal library, or even found a small educational institution. She had the ability to secure for herself the one thing female scholars had always lacked: time. No longer entirely dependent on male relatives for support, she could dedicate years to her own writing, study, or artistic endeavors, using her financial autonomy to construct a life of the mind. The late medieval period thus stands as a pivotal moment of disruption and possibility. The old structures of feudal society and university learning had been profoundly shaken. In the spaces between the collapse of the familiar and the slow emergence of a new order, women found themselves with more room to maneuver. They were not suddenly welcomed into the halls of power, but the ground had shifted beneath everyone's feet. The pressing needs of a society rebuilding itself, the search for new spiritual anchors, and the sudden flow of capital into their hands created a unique convergence of opportunities. It was in this fragile, transitional world that the quiet, persistent work of women scholars could gain a firmer foothold, setting the stage for the even greater intellectual revolutions that would follow in the centuries to come. A girl's education in medieval Europe depended as much on her address as on her ancestry. The map of female intellectual opportunity was a patchwork of stark contrasts, where the very same century could offer a humanist classroom in one city and near total exclusion in another. In the bustling, merchant-driven city-states of Italy, a remarkable window of possibility opened for daughters of the elite. The cultural movement known as humanism, with its renewed focus on classical literature and rhetoric, created an unexpected demand for educated women. In Florence and Venice, wealthy fathers began to see value in providing their daughters with a rigorous humanist education, not for a public career, but as a marker of family prestige and a means to elevate the intellectual tone of the household. These young women studied the works of Cicero and Virgil, mastered Greek and Latin, and engaged in philosophical discourse, becoming celebrated ornaments of their powerful families and proving that female intellect, when cultivated, could achieve dazzling heights. North of the Alps, the picture was often far more restricted. In the feudal kingdoms of England and France, the doors to formal education remained firmly closed to women. The great universities of Oxford, Paris, and Bologna were exclusively male domains, their gates barred by both statute and tradition. Yet even here, knowledge found its channels. The royal court and great aristocratic households became alternate centers of learning. A queen like Elena of Aquitaine or a duchess of Burgundy could create a microclimate of culture around her, employing tutors for her children and their companions, and surrounding herself with poets and scholars. Within these rarefied circles, a noblewoman might receive an impressive education, but it was an exception granted by privilege, not a right available to a wider population. The convent remained the most consistent, though limited, path to literacy and study for women across these regions, a sanctuary of the mind within a largely restrictive landscape. One of the most striking exceptions flourished in the urban centers of the Low Countries. Here, the Beguine movement created a unique and revolutionary model. These lay religious communities allowed women to live together in pious self-sufficiency, supporting themselves through teaching, weaving, and healthcare. The Beguine courts of cities like Bruges and Ghent became vibrant, self-governed enclaves where women could pursue a life of study and devotion without taking permanent vows. They organized their own schools, copied and read books, and engaged in theological discussion, building an educational space entirely outside the control of both the university and the traditional monastery. Their very existence demonstrated that when women could control their own communal and economic lives, intellectual pursuit naturally followed. This geographical mosaic reveals a crucial truth. The story of medieval women's scholarship is not one of uniform suppression, but of uneven terrain. Local economics, political structures, and cultural values created pockets of unexpected openness where the seeds of learning could take root. The flourishing of a female scholar in Renaissance Florence was made possible by a specific confluence of wealth, ideology, and urban culture that simply did not exist in a rural English manner. This variation reminds us that history is rarely a simple narrative of progress or oppression, but a complex tapestry where the light of knowledge flickered brightly in some places, while in others it was forced to burn with a much quieter but no less determined flame. The ink on the page was only the final step in a long and costly process. For a medieval woman to become a scholar, she needed more than a brilliant mind. She required a room of her own, a steady supply of expensive vellum, and the rare freedom from endless daily tasks. The most fundamental material condition was quiet space, a physical sanctuary where uninterrupted thought was possible. In a bustling noble household or a crowded urban dwelling, such privacy was a luxury few women could claim. Their days were consumed by the management of servants, the oversight of food production, and the complex social obligations of their station. The mental energy required for deep study was often drained by these relentless domestic demands, leaving little room for the slow, patient work of writing or copying manuscripts. How could one contemplate philosophy while directing the preservation of meat for winter or settling disputes among the staff? The intellectual life demanded a withdrawal from the world that was, for most, structurally impossible. This is why the convent was such a transformative environment. It provided not just spiritual refuge but the material framework for scholarship. Within its walls, a woman was granted a private cell, a designated scriptorium, and a structured daily rhythm that intentionally carved out hours for study. The community shared the burdens of labor, freeing the individual from sole responsibility for survival and gifting her with that most precious scholarly resource, time. Here, the pursuit of knowledge was built into the very architecture of life. Access to books was another formidable barrier. Before the printing press, a single manuscript represented a staggering investment of labor and capital. The vellum itself, made from the carefully prepared skins of animals, was enormously expensive. The inks, pigments for illumination, and gold leaf required for a luxurious volume placed books far beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest. For a woman outside a convent, building a personal library was an almost unthinkable feat. She was dependent on the collections of male relatives or the generosity of a patron. This material scarcity made the convent library not just a room of books, but a treasure house of immeasurable value. It was a shared resource, a collective inheritance that empowered every member of the community with access to the great conversations of the past. A nun did not need personal wealth to study the works of Augustine or Aristotle. She only needed the institutional wealth of her religious house. Financial independence was the ultimate key. A woman under the legal and economic control of a father or husband had little autonomy to direct resources toward her intellectual passions. Her time and energy were considered his property. This is why widowhood could become an unexpected and often the only gateway to a life of the mind. A widow who inherited her husband's estate suddenly gained control over her own finances. She could choose to commission the copying of a book, to hire a tutor to improve her Latin, or to simply use her newfound security to dedicate her days to writing. This sudden autonomy allowed figures like Christine de Pizan to turn personal transition into a professional writing career, using her widow's portion to support herself and her children through her pen. The material conditions of these women's lives were not a backdrop to their scholarship, they were its very foundation. The ability to think deeply was a privilege purchased with quiet space, costly materials, and freedom from want. Their legacy reminds us that the history of ideas is also a history of economics, of who could afford the quiet and who had the means to buy the time to think. Letters were the lifeblood of medieval intellectual communities, a fragile network of ink and parchment that could cross kingdoms. For women scholars, these correspondences were not mere social pleasantries. They were a vital strategy for building influence and sharing knowledge beyond their immediate walls. Hildegard of Bingen was a master of this art. Her letters formed a web of intellectual exchange that stretched across Europe, connecting her remote monastery to the very centers of power. She wrote directly to popes advising them on church reform. She corresponded with emperors offering counsel on matters of state. She debated complex theological points with some of the leading male scholars of her day. Each letter was a carefully crafted document, a vehicle for disseminating her visionary ideas and securing the protection and resources her community needed to thrive. Through this steady stream of correspondence, she demonstrated that a woman's voice, if strategically deployed, could resonate in the halls of power and shape the intellectual currents of her age. In the secular world, noblewomen created different kinds of intellectual hubs. Wealthy and influential patrons like Elena of Aquitaine and her descendants transformed their courts into vibrant salons. These were not just places of luxury, but dynamic spaces of learning where poets, translators, and philosophers gathered. A noblewoman would act as the host and patron, facilitating conversations between thinkers who might otherwise never meet. She would commission new works, sponsor translation projects, and encourage the exchange of manuscripts. In these cultivated environments, a troubadour's poem could inspire a philosophical discussion, and an Arabic scientific text could be debated before being rendered into Latin. These salons were engines of cultural production, proving that intellectual community could be curated and sustained through patronage and personal connection, creating a powerful alternative to the male-dominated university. Perhaps the most resilient networks were the ones that linked convent to convent. A steady, quiet traffic of letters, books, and travelers moved between these religious communities, creating a transnational channel for the flow of ideas. A newly copied manuscript of theological commentary from a monastery in Germany might be sent to a sister community in France for review and copying. News of a compelling spiritual text would travel along these routes, prompting requests for copies. Abbesses corresponded with one another, sharing insights on managing their communities, discussing theological questions, and offering mutual support. This system allowed for a remarkable circulation of knowledge. A nun in Italy could be studying a text originally produced in England, her understanding shaped by glosses added by scribes in a third location. This was a silent, decentralized university for women. Its curriculum spread across 1,000 libraries and its faculty composed of every scribe, scholar, and abbess who participated in the chain of transmission. These intricate networks of correspondence and exchange reveal a profound truth. Medieval women scholars were not lonely geniuses working in isolation. They were deeply embedded in the intellectual life of their time, actively participating in conversations that shaped their world. They used letters to build alliances, salons to foster creativity, and convent networks to create a durable, self-sustaining system of knowledge. They prove that community is its own form of scholarship, a collective endeavor that ensures no idea and no voice is ever truly alone. The quiet hum of the scriptorium was about to be joined by a new sound, the rhythmic clatter of the printing press. This technological revolution in the 15th century dramatically reshaped the landscape of knowledge, offering women scholars a double-edged sword of unprecedented access and fresh obstacles. Suddenly, books were no longer singular, priceless artifacts, but objects that could be reproduced by the hundreds, spreading ideas faster and farther than ever before. For a woman with something to say, this meant her voice could now travel beyond the convent wall or the courtly salon, reaching readers she would never meet. The very medium that had preserved the works of Hildegard and Herrad was now being superseded by a faster, more democratic machine. Yet this new accessibility came with a hidden cost. The world of publishing was rapidly professionalizing, becoming a commercial industry dominated by male guilds, printers, and university networks. The intimate, collaborative process of creating a manuscript, where a woman could work directly with her sisters in a scriptorium, was replaced by a more formal and often inaccessible system. To get a book printed, an author now needed capital, connections to a printing house, and the approval of a largely male network that controlled distribution. The informal pathways women had so carefully cultivated were suddenly bypassed by a new, rigid highway, and many found themselves without a ticket to ride. Ironically, the printing press itself became a vehicle for the very women it would later make it harder to emulate. Early printers, hungry for content to feed their new machines, scoured library collections for anything that would sell. They rediscovered and printed the works of medieval women authors, ensuring their survival and wider dissemination. The Trota texts on women's medicine, once copied by hand in a few dozen monastic libraries, were now printed and circulated across the continent, standardizing medical practice for generations. The visionary writings of Hildegard of Bingen saw new editions, her voice amplified centuries after her time, but this process was not always faithful. Printers often altered texts, abridging them or adding new material to make them more marketable, sometimes blurring the original author's distinctive voice in the service of commerce. A few remarkable women, however, learned to navigate this new world with spectacular success. In the humanist circles of Venice, Cassandra Fedel used the technology to her advantage. A celebrated orator and scholar, she corresponded with thinkers across Europe, and her letters and orations were published in printed collections, spreading her reputation for brilliance. She demonstrated how a woman could use the print revolution to build a public intellectual identity, her humanist writings reaching an audience that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. Her fame, however, remained an exception, dependent on rare patronage and personal exceptionalism. The shift from script to print marks a pivotal moment of transition, a hinge between the medieval and early modern worlds. It promised a great democratization of knowledge, yet it also erected new professional barriers just as the old ones began to tremble. The quiet, collective work of preservation in the convent scriptorium was fading, replaced by the loud, commercial clamor of the printing house. For women scholars, it was a moment of both profound change and extraordinary possibility, a revolution that would forever change the rules of the game they had learned to play so well. The quiet work of modern scholars has become a new form of discovery, a patient sifting through centuries of silence to recover what was nearly lost. For generations, the intellectual contributions of medieval women were treated as footnotes or outright anomalies, their names fading from the record until a profound shift began in the late 20th century. A new wave of scholarship, emerging with fresh questions and a determination to look in forgotten places, started to systematically rewrite this chapter of history. These researchers began with a simple yet revolutionary premise. What if the absence of women from the intellectual record was not a fact of nature, but a problem with the historical lens itself? This change in perspective opened up entire libraries of possibility, transforming how we read the evidence left behind. One of the most significant breakthroughs has been the careful reattribution of anonymous works. For decades, a sophisticated medical text or a brilliantly illuminated manuscript without a named author was almost automatically credited to a man. Scholars are now revisiting these anonymous treasures, asking crucial contextual questions. Who had the knowledge and the means to produce this? Where was it created, and who had access to that space? By analyzing handwriting, artistic style, and the content's intended audience, researchers have successfully returned dozens of important texts to their likely female creators, restoring names to works that had been stripped of their identity. This thoughtful work extends to reading between the lines of old library catalogues and financial records, where a payment for vellum to an abbess or a note about a book commissioned by a noblewoman provides a vital clue to female authorship that was previously overlooked. The challenges in this recovery effort are immense. The evidence is often fragmentary, a single line in a chronicle or a name on a worn piece of parchment. Historians must also contend with layers of interpretation bias, where later scribes and scholars, assuming male authorship, deliberately altered pronouns or added male names to texts. Overcoming this requires a blend of traditional paleography and innovative digital tools. Digital humanities projects are now revolutionizing access to these rare sources. High-resolution scans of manuscripts are available online, allowing scholars from around the world to examine the same page simultaneously, zooming in on a faint marginal note or comparing script styles across continents. New databases are cataloging every known reference to medieval women writers, creating an interconnected web of information that reveals patterns and connections earlier researchers could never see. This is not simply about adding a few new names to the history books. It is about fundamentally rethinking the medieval intellectual world. By learning to ask different questions of the evidence, we discover that women were not on the periphery of scholarship, but were often at the very heart of knowledge production, in the scriptorium, the court, and the garden. The work of recovery demonstrates that history is not a fixed story written in stone, but a living conversation. Each rediscovered text, each reattributed manuscript, adds another piece to a vast and beautiful mosaic, slowly giving form to a past that is far richer, more complex, and more complete than we ever knew. Their stories are not just echoes from a distant past, but a living conversation with our present. The strategies these medieval women perfected for pursuing knowledge under constraint feel remarkably familiar to many scholars today. They mastered the art of building intellectual community where formal institutions excluded them, creating networks of support and mentorship that mirror the alliances formed by marginalized academics in our own time. They understood that progress often depends on finding hidden pathways and creating one's own space for thought, a lesson that resonates deeply in any era where access is not a given. Their legacy challenges the very notion of a single, linear tradition of knowledge, insisting instead that wisdom has always flowed through many streams, many of which were quietly tended by voices we are only now learning to hear. This recovered history fundamentally reshapes our image of the Middle Ages. It transforms the period from a stark landscape dominated by castles and cathedrals into a far more intricate and dynamic world, one where intellectual life pulsed in convents, courts, and urban workshops. Recognizing the contributions of women reveals the medieval period as a time of rich, interdisciplinary exchange, not a dark interlude between classical and Renaissance glory. Their work proves that the preservation of civilization's knowledge was never the sole project of a few great men in ivory towers, but a vast, collaborative endeavor that relied on the meticulous labor and brilliant insights of countless forgotten minds. Perhaps their most enduring lesson lies in their approach to knowledge itself. They refused to compartmentalize the world into separate boxes of science, spirituality, and art. Hildegard of Bingen saw no contradiction between studying the medicinal properties of a plant and hearing the music of the spheres. A scribe illuminating a manuscript understood that beautiful presentation deepened intellectual and spiritual engagement. This holistic view, which wove together the practical, the theoretical, and the sacred, offers a powerful alternative to our modern age of extreme specialization. It reminds us that the most profound understanding often emerges at the intersections, in the spaces between disciplines where different ways of knowing can inform and enrich one another. The quiet persistence of these women scholars ensures that the map of our intellectual heritage is now being redrawn, becoming more complete and more truthful with each recovered name. Their legacy is a testament to the fact that the pursuit of knowledge is a human impulse that cannot be permanently confined, and that the full story of our past is always more surprising and more hopeful than we had been led to believe. The journey through this hidden history reshapes the very ground beneath our feet. We have moved from the solitary cell of Hildegard of Bingen to the vibrant classrooms of Herrad of Landsberg, from the self-sufficient workshops of the Beguines to the translation centers of royal courts. This is not a collection of isolated exceptions, but a rich tapestry of intellectual achievement woven across centuries. The so-called Dark Ages were in fact illuminated by the quiet, persistent light of these women's minds. They were not merely copying the past, they were actively building the future, preserving fragile threads of classical knowledge while weaving in their own innovative insights. Their collective story challenges a fundamental assumption that intellectual history is a straight line drawn by a select few. It reveals instead a much broader, more collaborative landscape, a network of preservation that depended as much on the anonymous scribe as the celebrated philosopher. The work of these scholars teaches us that our understanding of the past is never complete when it overlooks half the population. Knowledge survives not through the efforts of a single great library or university, but through the dedicated, often uncelebrated labor of diverse individuals working within and creatively around the constraints of their time. This is the enduring wisdom Christine de Pizan voiced in the 1400s, a poignant reminder that capability is universal, but opportunity is not. She wrote that if it were customary to send daughters to school like sons, they would learn just as fully and understand the subtleties of all arts and sciences. Her words are not a lament but a powerful testament to the potential that was and is always present. Let their rediscovered legacy be an invitation. It asks us to look more carefully at history's margins, to listen for the whispers in the archives, and to question the completeness of any story that speaks with only one voice. For every name we have recovered, countless others still await their moment in the light. If these stories have expanded your understanding of the medieval world, consider sharing this exploration to help others discover these remarkable women. We would love to hear in the comments which of these scholars you found most inspiring and whose story changed your view of history.